Hey guys, we are the Null Operators, and this is video number 5 in our Learn to Code with Java web series. Today we're going to be covering methods.
So what are methods? One, methods and functions are the same thing. You'll hear them referred to as both ways depending on the language. So if you hear functions, if you hear methods, they both mean the same thing. And what they are is basically some bit of code that runs, right? So I have main here, right? Main itself is a method. So whenever the program starts, it knows to go look for main and run whatever's in main. I can write other methods besides that. Say if I had public static int area with int r, we're going to find the area of a circle using this method. So we'll return math, not all caps, math.py, a equals pi r squared. So times, and then math.pow r, comma, 2. And we'll need to change this return type to a double. And don't worry, I'm going to explain all these things after we get through our example. So just follow along for now. So if I try to print out, for example, the area of a circle with a radius of 2, I would get this number here, right? So we could have just done this exact same thing up here, right? If I had taken this and I'd put it up here, so 2 squared, right? We would have gotten the same answer. We get the 12.566. But it starts to get tedious, right, if I have a whole bunch of these. And this is a pretty simple calculation. It's pi times the area of the, pi times the radius squared, which is relatively simple. But even then, like if I wanted to do a bunch of these, it's going to start getting tedious very quickly. So if I wanted to do 6 and I wanted to do an 8, all of these are going to take up time, whereas I could just call this method, which is faster, right? I can just say area of 6, and I can say area of 8. So it saves me time by basically writing a bit of code that I know that I'm going to be using over and over again, so that I don't have to repeat my code, because it's a waste of time to write this over and over again when I could just simplify it into a function call, right? So let's delve into what this function call actually means. We have a bunch of keywords here. We have public, static, double, and then the name and the parameter, right? So public is something that's going to make more sense once we get to classes and objects. But all you need to know is that you can be public or you can be private, and who can call this method changes depending on whether you're public or private. Since we're inside of the same class as main, I can call this whether it's public or private. It doesn't matter. But if there was another class outside of this, I wouldn't be able to call this if it was private. I could only access it if it was public. And again, that'll make more sense in the future. For now, just know that they exist and include them, but don't worry too much about them. Now, the static keyword is, again, going to make more sense once we get to classes and objects. But the important thing here is if I want to call a static method inside the same class, it has to be from another static method. So main is a static method. So that means if I want to call area, which is inside the same class, then it also needs to be static. So one more time, don't worry too much about this. You'll learn more about it later. For now, just know that it needs to be there if you're inside the same class as main. So the third thing is called the return type. It's basically what comes out of this method. So I'm sending this floating point value back, right? So it's going to be a double because this is going to be a decimal number. It's 12.566, whatever. So I need to specify I'm going to be giving you back a number that looks like this. Or, if it was a character or a Boolean value that I was sending back. If I was sending back a true or a false, I would put Boolean here. Just along those lines. So your return type means whatever's coming out of this, I need to specify it up here. So the fourth thing is going to be the name of your method, and you can call this anything. It's just the name, right? And then the last thing is going to be your parameters. So here we just have one, and it's basically what do I need in order for this method to run? In order to calculate the area of a circle, I need to know what the radius is. So I'm going to pull that in from wherever calls the method, and I'll use that radius to then calculate this and send it back. And here I just have one parameter, right? But I could have infinite. I could have as many as I needed, right? And they can be all different types as well. Boolean C, right? So it doesn't matter. You can have a whole bunch of different parameters. It's just whatever your method or function needs in order to run, you'll specify up here. So one common mistake I see a lot is people think that their parameters and their return type needs to match. They do not. They have nothing to do with each other, right? So the parameters, again, are what do I need in order for this method to run? In order for this method to run, I need a radius. I could pass it as an integer. I could pass it as a double, but that doesn't have anything to do with the return type. The return type will be a double because I'm using math.pi, right? I know that pi is a decimal number, so I'm going to get a decimal answer because I'm multiplying it by some integer. So my answer is going to be a double because I'm using math.pi, but that doesn't affect my parameters whatsoever. So let's do another example here. Before, we dealt with arrays, right? So if I create an integer array, call it ARR, say it's a new integer array of size 50, right? That's a little too large for an example. We'll just do size 15. And I'll create a second array. I'll call this ARR2, and I'll make this size 10. I can make a third array. I'll call this ARR3, and I'll go back and call this ARR1. Why not? And I'll just make this size 1. We can then start creating some methods to handle the tedious work with the arrays, right? So first, if I wanted to get all the values for an array, I would have to get input from the user, and then I would have to go through the array, putting each one of those values inside of the slots in the array, right? Well, I can do that in a method. So if we write this, we'll say public static void. And if you recall, the third thing is the return type, right? So let me finish this. We'll say fill array. And it's just going to take in the array that's supposed to be filled. So again, this third thing is supposed to be the return type, right? But I put void here, just like I did in main. Void means that there is nothing that's being returned. This is going to basically run the task that it needs to, and then it'll finish. It won't send any data back to main. So before, whenever we were printing the area, we needed to know what the area was. So we sent it back to main where it was used in a print statement. We could have had the print statement in the function, in which case it would have also been void. So it depends on whether you're sending a value back or not, whether this is void or whether it has some data type. So let's continue with this method then. We take in some array, right? In order to fill the array with values, I need to know what the array is. And so I'm going to ask the user, please enter the values for your array. And then we'll create our scanner. System.in, and we'll create our loop. Let's go from 0 to the array's length, going up by 1, just the standard array for loop. Array.length. Oh, simple mistake there. I forgot to have the actual condition. And then we'll say the array at I is equal to scan.nextInt. So basically that tedium that we did before of I want to fill the array with values, so I need to ask the user and then get all of them. We can put this inside of a method, and now I can just say fill array with array1, and then fill array with array2. And array3. So this saves me a huge amount of time because I don't have to write this entire thing 3 times. I can just call the function that does it 3 times. So it'll fill all 3 of these arrays, presenting them with a message, and then getting the values from the user. And likewise, if I wanted to print out the values of the array, I could write a function to do that. So I can say void print array. So in order to print an array, I need to know what array I want to print, right? And for this one, I'll just system.out.println. I'll say array values are. We'll have our loop. And then we'll print out each value. So we will, all on the same line, say array at I plus a space. So now, just like before with the fill array, I can also print each one of these arrays just by calling the function instead of having to write all that code 3 times. So you might be able to see now why these are so powerful. And these are simple methods, right? Like these are not very complex at all. So whenever you have really complex bits of code where this is, 50 lines long, you definitely don't want to write that multiple times. You just want to write that one time and then call the method so that it saves you time and it makes your code easier to read as well. So if we ran this, say, please enter the values for your array. So I'll just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Boom, that's the first one. And then this one will be 0, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then the last one, I'll just say, 3. So now we get all these. I need to fix these prints. Well, we'll say, at the end of this, we'll just have an empty print line. So I'll make these smaller just so we can run this again and test it, and it'll be a little bit cleaner. So first one, we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Second one, 3, 2, 1. Last one, 0. And we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 2, 1, 0. So it filled the arrays and it printed the arrays, all with just these little bits of code, because they say go and look at this method, do whatever's inside of it, and then come back to main, right? So you're telling the program basically, stop what you're doing, go find this, run whatever's there, and then come back and move down to the next line. And that's the way that methods work. And one thing you might not have realized is that you've been using methods this entire time. For example, this system.out.println, right? This .println is a method. It says, print this message. And printing a message to the screen is actually pretty complicated. So there's a bunch of stuff happening whenever you call this print line that takes this text and puts it out onto the console, right? And then whenever we get to classes and objects, you'll start to understand what these things before the method call are, where I have system.out, etc. System.in here, scan.nextInt. This is another function call. So this is going to become more apparent, more clear whenever we get to classes and objects. But for now, know that these things that you've been using with the parentheses, those are function calls. So one last thing I want to cover here is with functions with return types, right? I'll get rid of these. I'll get rid of all this. Let's say I just create a string ed. I'll write a function that returns a string. I'll say public string, or public static string, sorry. String give value, just for lack of a better word. And you'll see that I don't even have any parameters here, and that's perfectly fine. I don't have to have parameters. It's just I need parameters whenever I need to know something in order to run this method, right? In my case, I'm just going to return a value. I'm just going to return a string that says ed. So I don't need to know anything to do that. I'm just going to return a string. And so this string ed now, I can say it's equal to the method call. So because this returns a string, you can think of this as representing a string, right? This is actually a value. In this case, it's ed. So if I had a sum method or something like that that returned a value, that would represent an integer. So based on what your return type is, your actual call for your method represents a value. So you can do things like assignment and printing and even calculations with those things. So just recognize that, because a void method, if we wrote another one, say public static void test. And this is just going to print out test. All right, so a void method would just kind of be floating out in space on its own. So test would run and it would print out test. I could also do that with give value, right? Like there's nothing stopping me from saying give value floating out in space, but we have to think about what is give value doing? It's just returning ed. So basically what I've written here is not anything useful. I basically only written, hold on, ed, and then a semicolon. That does absolutely nothing, right? It's just a value floating out in space. So we have to think about what are our method calls returning and then do something useful with them. Like in this case, I want to store whatever I got back in that in a string because you gave me a string. So try and think about that whenever you're using your methods. And that'll be it for this video. Please remember to like, subscribe, and click the bell notification icon. It helps us out a lot. And in the next video, we'll be covering multidimensional arrays.